What if I told you Jeffrey Epstein, the disgraced financier, never really existed, and that the man we all think we know was just the face of a CIA and Mossad operation designed to control the very people we believe run our world? It's been 6 years since his passing, and yet here we are still talking about him, and the questions only continue to pile up with absolutely no answers. Questions like, how does the college dropout from Brooklyn become one of the most connected men on earth? How does someone with no legitimate business model sustain a billion-dollar lifestyle? Why did powerful institutions protect him for decades? And perhaps most importantly, who was really funding and using Jeffrey Epstein to begin with? Because the more you look at this whole scandal, you realize we've been asking the wrong questions this whole time. We've been trying to understand Epstein as some criminal financier, a socialite. But what if he was something else altogether? What if everything he built was designed to compromise the most powerful people on Earth? Because when you actually try to explore the mechanics of how his empire was built, something strange begins to emerge. The trail goes cold, and then it becomes very clear that there's far more to this picture than we're told in the media. At his peak, Epstein was worth an alleged $600 million, and his lifestyle would have cost some $40 to $60 million per year to maintain. In the US Virgin Islands, he owned not one but two private islands. Liz of St. James, 70 acres of Caribbean paradise, came complete with a main residence, guest villas, a library, a movie theatre, and staff quarters for the 70 employees who kept the operation running. The second island, Great St. James, was 165 acres that he purchased for $18 million. Then there was the 7,500-acre Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, larger than Manhattan with an airstrip long enough to handle his private jets. And there's a Palm Beach mansion, a Paris apartment, and other properties we probably don't even know about. He also owned a stunning Manhattan townhouse, 21,000 square feet on the Upper East Side, the largest private residence in New York City, 7 stories and 40 rooms of marble. As we all know by now, Epstein's parties brought together an impossible mix of Nobel Peace Prize winners, tech billionaires, politicians, and celebrities. These weren't just casual gatherings, these were lavish events that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars each, featuring private chefs, rare wines, and entertainment that kept the world's most powerful people coming back for more. He traveled in a converted Boeing 727. He had a Gulfstream 4 jet, helicopters, and a fleet of luxury cars and boats, including a 130-foot yacht named Lady Ghislaine, after his closest associate. And all of this, every mansion, every jet, every staff member, every elaborate dinner party was supposedly just funded by one man's genius at trading currencies? Because according to most sources, this is just what Epstein was, which is where our story really begins. Because you would think all of that money leaves a trail we can use to understand and legitimize Epstein's wealth and lifestyle. But when you do that, you find dead end after dead end. First, every hedge fund managing over $100 million must file quarterly Form 13F reports with the SEC. It's federal law, you detail your holdings, trades, and assets under management or face criminal charges. Jeffrey Epstein never even filed one. In over 20 years of claiming to manage billions of dollars, there's not a single regulatory filing with his name on it. Second, if you're running a legitimate hedge fund, you need prime brokerage relationships with major Wall Street firms to execute trades. These create massive paper trails through trade confirmations and settlement records. Epstein had personal bank accounts but no prime brokerage relationships anywhere. Douglas Cass, a hedge fund manager who spent years investigating Epstein's claims, found that not one institutional trading desk, primary or secondary, had ever traded with Epstein's firm. Third, Epstein claimed his speciality was currency trading at massive scale. Eric Weinstein, who worked with Peter Thiel in finance, explains why this is basically impossible to fake.
He would have to move the market if he was, doing a yard of euros or Swiss francs or who knows what, as like $1 billion. That would move the market. So there's no way you can fake retroactively a hedge fund of immeasurable size that trades currencies. I don't think he was a currency trader.
If you're moving billions in forex positions, you're tangibly affecting global exchange rates. That leaves permanent, verifiable traces. When Weinstein met Epstein face-to-face in 2004, the trading genius couldn't even discuss his area of expertise.
He was a weird guy who didn't seem to know a lot about currency trading, claiming to run a multi-billion-dollar FX hedge fund.
The meeting with Epstein was deeply unsettling. Weinstein described
the fact that he had a lipstick camera pointed at me from an art object, that he laid a table that was preposterously long and thin with a tablecloth made of an American flag to make it look like a coffin so that I would spill my coffee on the flag of my own country.
That sounds like a script from a movie.
Most disturbing of all, Epstein knew intimate details about Weinstein's unpublished mathematical research that virtually no one else knew. When Weinstein left that meeting, he called his wife with a chilling assessment.
When the meeting was over, I immediately called my wife and I said, I have just met a construct. She said, what do you mean? I said, this person is not who they claim to be. Somebody has constructed this human being to be something that they are not.
Epstein might just be exactly that, a construct, but who built him and for what purpose? But before we continue, I want to tell you that this video is sponsored by Raycon. I've been using Raycons a bunch recently, because Raycon's brand new essential open earbuds are just so lightweight in your ear, and you'll honestly just forget you're even wearing them. Personally, I really like them because they're built for life on the go, and they just slip on effortlessly and stay comfortable all day long while you have them in, which is perfect when I'm trying to work on these videos, and can listen to music and podcasts completely distraction free. And the best part, they don't actually block out the whole world. You can actually stay tuned into your surroundings while still enjoying your music and podcasts. I also just like to use them on my daily walks, as I can throw on a podcast and stay in my zone but still hear traffic or when someone's calling my name, which is why Raycon's really just the perfect balance, as they're clear, they've got great quality audio while still allowing you to stay connected to what's happening around you, and they're also insanely comfortable. I'll literally wear them for hours and forget they're even on. Plus the battery life is insane. You get 8 hours per charge and 36 hours total with the case, and the case itself is pocket friendly, splash proof, and even charges wirelessly. So if you're looking for earbuds that move with you, whether you're commuting, working, or just wanting to live your life, Raycon's essential open earbuds are the way to go. Go to buyraycon.com/moonytopen to get 20% off of your order of essential open earbuds. That's buyraycon.com/moonytopen for 20% off. Well, to understand this, let's go back a few years to understand Jeffrey. He was born in Brooklyn in 1953 to a middle-class family. His father worked as a groundskeeper for the New York City Parks Department. Nothing in his early life suggested he was destined for extraordinary wealth or influence. He attended Cooper Union briefly, then transferred to New York University, but never graduated from either institution. In 1974, at just 21 years old, this college dropout somehow managed to talk his way into a teaching position at the Dalton School, one of Manhattan's most elite prep schools. He was hired to teach calculus and physics to the children of New York's wealthiest families. The man who hired him was Donald Barr, the school's headmaster. Barr was also the father of future Attorney General William Barr, and notably a former officer in the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. So why would someone with intelligence connections hire an unqualified 21-year-old to teach at such a prestigious institution? It was an unusual decision that would mark the beginning of a pattern in Epstein's life, unexplainable opportunities that seemed to come from nowhere. The pattern continued when he joined Bear Stearns in 1976, one of Wall Street's most prestigious investment banks, only to leave in murky circumstances and establish his own consultancy for billionaire investors. But in years of operation, Epstein secured just one client that anyone can actually identify, and that man is Leslie Wexner, who was once everything Jeffrey Epstein claimed to be. He was a legitimate billionaire who had built limited brands, the parent company of Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie & Fitch, and dozens of other retail giants, into the largest clothing manufacturing and distribution empire in the US. By the late 80s, Wexner was worth billions, forming a secretive group of pro-Israel billionaires called the Mega Group, defined as a loosely organized club of 20 of the nation's wealthiest and most influential Jewish businessmen, focused on philanthropy and Jewishness, with membership dues upwards of $30,000 per year. The Mega Group also includes a man called Ronald Lauder, who was connected to Epstein's boss at Bear Stearns. Lauder is a long-term friend of Donald Trump. In 1997, the NSA intercepted communications between Israeli intelligence officers discussing a top-secret espionage operation. They were talking about using a high-value American asset, codenamed Mega, to steal classified US government documents. John Schindler, a former NSA counterintelligence officer who spent his career hunting foreign spies and is still the current-day professor of national security affairs at the US Naval War College, has also connected these dots. He's concluded that the mega operation the Israelis were discussing and the Mega Group funding Epstein are connected. We know that Mega was viewed by Israeli intelligence officials as a vehicle for espionage and influence operations in the United States. We know that it was co-founded by Jeffrey Epstein's billionaire benefactor. This chapter to the Epstein story gets even weirder when you learn that Wexner's previous tax attorney named Arthur Shapiro was executed before testifying to a jury about tax evasion, in what police called a mafia-style hit.
There was a point in the 1980s when, it might have been the early 90s actually, Wexner again owned Victoria's Secret. For a guy like Jeffrey Epstein, that's kind of a gold mine you're sitting on, right? Because he would go out and he would pose as a talent scout. He would tell people that he was that, and he would present credentials that made it plausible. And he would get girls who wanted to be models, who wanted to be in Victoria's Secret, to pose for him, and then he would sexually assault them.
So somehow, with no proven track record, Epstein convinced one of America's most successful businessmen to hand him control of everything. Alternatively, you could just say that this situation had been engineered to transfer wealth and power to Epstein. Tucker's reaction captured what any rational person would think.
Genuinely fascinated by that detail, because that is, a man who builds, like all of these characters, they're unusual people. They're not average people. They're extraordinary people. By definition, you build $1 billion company, good or bad, you're not like everybody else, and you're good in business, and you're careful and judicious, and you don't hand power of attorney over to some guy you've never worked with.
Soon, Epstein was living in Manhattan's largest private residence, a 7-story, $77 million townhouse that Wexner had purchased for $13.2 million in 1987, only to transfer it to Epstein for exactly $0 in 2011. This was the lifestyle of a billionaire, funded entirely by one man who had known him for less than 2 years. Wexner later claimed that Epstein had stolen his money rather than being gifted to him. But by this point, Epstein wasn't building this empire alone. By his side was a woman whose very presence raises huge questions about who Epstein really is. Ghislaine Maxwell was the daughter of Robert Maxwell, a media mogul whose mysterious death in 1991 had left behind more questions than answers. Robert Maxwell's background is incredibly unusual. Having escaped Jewish persecution in the Second World War, he became a British politician and later brought up several major publishing companies. But there was a darker side to his operations. According to Mossad officer Ari Ben, Maxwell had spent decades operating as what intelligence professionals call a triple agent, working simultaneously for MI6, the KGB, and Mossad, running operations that generated hundreds of millions of dollars while providing unprecedented intelligence access to governments worldwide. This was even later discussed by the UK's Foreign Office and made major British newspaper headlines. Maxwell's greatest coup was an operation involving software called Promise. Using his immense power and network, Maxwell distributed legitimate software with Israeli intelligence embedded backdoors into it. Then he sells this compromised software to governments in some 40 countries in total, and every time they use it, Israeli intelligence can see everything they do. Now, Maxwell had been traveling on the yacht Lady Ghislaine, named after his daughter, when he was suddenly found dead floating in the Atlantic Ocean. 3 different pathologists couldn't agree on the cause of death, which was suggested to be a heart attack. His Mossad connections were all but confirmed when he received an Israeli state funeral, with the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir declaring that Maxwell had done more for the state of Israel than can now be said. Within months of her father's death, Ghislaine Maxwell had moved to New York and became Jeffrey Epstein's closest associate. Stephen Hoffenberg, who worked with Epstein in the 80s, claimed Robert Maxwell introduced Epstein to Ghislaine before his death. This all happened in the same year that Epstein took over Leslie Wexner's finances, and you can really see how these two events collided, and the timing is very suspicious. So now, a woman who had grown up in the world of international intelligence operations was now managing the social calendar of America's most mysterious billionaire. The stage was set, and as Jeffrey Epstein's power grew, so too did the scope of what he was being used for. Now let's confront the topic that's been on everyone's minds. What exactly was he doing at those elaborate parties for the super rich? How might they have benefited Epstein? Well, at the center of Epstein's network is Epstein Island, 78 acres of Caribbean paradise 40 miles east of Puerto Rico. The list of people who are confirmed to have visited includes some of the most well-known names in modern history: Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, George Mitchell, John Glenn, Kevin Spacey, Chris Tucker, and Itzhak Perlman, and even somehow Stephen Hawking, all apparently confirmed by Epstein's longtime pilot Larry Vysotsky at Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. While merely visiting the island doesn't imply anything criminal, there's also the infamous client list, which allegedly contains the detail of those who had a more specific kind of relationship with Epstein. The island's true purpose is pretty well known now, but it becomes even clearer when you understand what else was there: thousands of cameras. According to Ghislaine Maxwell's own reported comments to friends, Epstein's properties were equipped with extensive surveillance systems that served as an insurance policy through recording so-called compromising activities. Over the past few years, more details have surfaced about what those so-called compromising activities really include. One of Epstein's most well-known accusers, Virginia, described being flown to the island repeatedly, where she was passed around like a platter of fruit, being shared by Epstein's powerful associates. The island became the ultimate venue for what prosecutors would later describe as systemic abuse involving dozens of woman. But the island was just one stage in a larger theater of dark psychological intimidation. The Manhattan townhouse Epstein received from Wexner shows a more surreal side to Epstein's operations. The New York Times published photos from inside that looked like something from a fever dream, with framed prosthetic eyeballs lined in the entryway, a grotesque welcoming committee for visitors watching everyone who entered, a sculpture of a woman in a wedding dress clinging to a rope, dangled from the ceiling like a warning, paintings of Bill Clinton in a dress shown to everyone. Lining the walls were photos of Epstein with some of the most powerful people on the planet: Pope John Paul II, Fidel Castro, Elon Musk, Mick Jagger, Donald Trump with a young Melania, Bill Clinton, a framed dollar bill signed by Bill Gates with "I was wrong" scrawled across George Washington's face. Bookshelves displayed a first edition copy of an infamous novel about a middle-aged man's obsession with a girl. But the key of all was that painting we spoke about earlier. Right in the main entrance, a large oil painting of former President Bill Clinton lounging in the Oval Office wearing this blue dress and red heels. The message: even former presidents could be humiliated, compromised, reduced to objects of mockery. Nobody was safe. And if you'd entered Epstein's world, you were compromised. And again, there were allegedly cameras everywhere. Maria Farmer, who filed the first FBI complaint against Epstein in 1966, described a hidden control room behind an invisible door with all this limestone, containing stacked monitors displaying feeds from cameras, positioned in bedrooms and bathrooms throughout the property. When FBI agents raided the Manhattan property in 2019, they found safes containing labeled CDs with descriptions like "young name and name," catalog evidence of systemic abuse carefully organized for easy retrieval. In a recent Joe Rogan podcast, Joe asks former CIA agent Mike Baker over whether he'd come across such an operation before.
You think this freak show of Epstein wasn't like, it didn't have hidden cameras or wasn't taped and shit? Or what? I mean, come on.
So 100%.
Yeah.
But Mossad, whoever it is that was involved in this intelligence gathering, I mean, I'm just guessing.
Right,
I have no idea. But there's fucking pinhole cameras all over that house.
But it actually gets worse. The deal also granted immunity to any unnamed co-conspirators, effectively protecting Epstein's entire network of powerful associates. And the whole arrangement was kept secret from the victims, which violated federal law. When Acosta was later asked how he could justify such an arrangement, he said, "I was told that Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone." The case was above his pay grade. This led many to conclude that powerful forces were protecting Epstein at the time. It seemed that the situation was being influenced to keep the Epstein operation running for a bit longer. 10 years down the line, the second time Epstein was arrested would be the last. And this time, the charges were much more serious, carrying a potential 45-year sentence. And that's when the lid blew off the whole story. An operation that was probably designed not to be around in the internet age was now being discovered by everyone. Finally, the man who had spent decades collecting blackmail on the world's most powerful people was behind bars. People were outraged that this could possibly even happen behind closed doors. Everybody wanted answers. Was this some kind of eyes wide shut scenario? Suddenly, every politician, every celebrity, every business leader who had ever been photographed with Epstein was rushing to explain their relationship. Trump, who was now president, suddenly had to explain why he'd called Epstein a best friend, a terrific guy in 2002, and said he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. Trump claimed they'd then had a falling out years earlier and that he'd banned Epstein from Mar-a-Lago for being a creep, but the details just kept on changing. Was it 2004 or 2007? The timeline shifted depending on when he was asked. Even Epstein said they were best friends for over 10 years.
That was quite a shame.
Bill Clinton's people issued frantic statements about how the former president had not spoken to Epstein in well over a decade and knows nothing about the terrible crimes. Prince Andrew went on BBC and gave one of the most disastrous interviews in royal history, claiming he couldn't sweat due to a medical condition, didn't even remember meeting Virginia despite photographic evidence of them together. The walls surrounding Epstein's finances also started to collapse, and what people found inside looked nothing like a legitimate finance professional's affairs. JP Morgan had been Epstein's primary bank for 15 years, and internal bank documents show that compliance officers knew something was wrong as early as 2006. He was making huge withdrawals every month while financing his billionaire lifestyle. They didn't want to act on it though, as Epstein was bringing in wealthy clients. Jess Staley, a senior executive, exchanged 1,200 emails with Epstein and even visited his private island. Many of these emails contained weird, unexplained references, such as Snow White, which seemed to pop up repeatedly. A lawyer recently said Epstein's entire business with JP Morgan and JP Morgan's entire business with Jeffrey was human trafficking. Senator Ron Wyden spent 3 years investigating Treasury Department files and claimed to find 4,725 wire transfers totaling nearly $1.1 billion flowing through just one of Epstein's accounts. Wyden said many payments were associated with sanctioned Russian banks.
4,725 wire transfers adding up to nearly $1.1 billion flowing in and out of just one of Mr. Epstein's bank accounts.
And we will probably know what allegedly happened next to Epstein, but to say things don't add up might be the understatement of the decade. First, both cameras outside a cell had malfunctioned. The guards assigned to check on him every 30 minutes had fallen asleep suddenly and falsified their records for 8 hours. His cellmate had been removed the day before without replacement, leaving him alone despite regulations requiring a cellmate for someone on the watch. The surveillance footage that should have captured everything was later found to be edited, with metadata showing it had been modified using Adobe Premiere Pro. When forensic experts examined the video, they found nearly 3 minutes were missing. Government officials claimed there was only one camera recording, but there were actually 11 cameras in the area. Most just mysteriously stopped working before Epstein's death. While NYC's medical examiner agreed with the official account of what happened to Epstein, Dr. Michael Baden, the pathologist hired by Epstein's family, said he'd more likely been strangled. We may never know what happened that day, but the chaos around Epstein was only intensified. His accomplice Maxwell, who was arrested after Epstein, has somehow avoided much of it, after recently being moved by Trump from a low security prison to a minimum security facility. And this new facility has a reputation for feeling like a campus more than a prison and is often reserved for celebrity guests. It's highly unusual for someone with trafficking convictions, and seemed to happen just 1 week after she met with Trump's Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche. Just actually let that sink in. This is how the justice system deals with abuse on an industrial scale. Others connected to Epstein's web suffered a much worse fate. Virginia supposedly unalived herself at her farm in Australia, making 3 Epstein accusers deceased since 2017. At least 22 people connected to Epstein died under very suspicious circumstances, Stephen Hoffenberg among them. He was the last living person to have known Epstein since the 1980s. Hoffenberg described Epstein's operations as national security issues, involving, quote, blackmail influence trading information at a level that is very suspicious and dangerous. He was cooperating with the FBI when he died of natural causes. Meanwhile, Trump has returned to the White House promising to release all the Epstein files, with the entire case becoming a football kicked between one side of the American political spectrum to the other. The head of the FBI, Kash Patel, came on Joe Rogan to say there was nothing suspicious about the tapes. He hadn't seen anything, as he apparently personally reviewed all of them, and so we should all just move on and forget about it.
15 years of people coming in and creating fictions about this that doesn't exist. Where's the videotape of an Epstein Island of X, Y, and Z committing these frauds? Why haven't you given it to us? Do you really think I wouldn't give that to you?
And the Justice Department has now delivered what they so desperately want to be the final blow. In a memo, they concluded there was no client list, no evidence of blackmail, and no reason to release any additional files. The case, as we know it, is closed. At least that's what they want you to think. So here we are 6 years later, still asking the very same questions we started with. How can a college dropout from Brooklyn become one of the most connected men on earth? How does someone with no legitimate business model sustain a billion-dollar lifestyle? Why did powerful institutions protect him for decades? It's clear that Epstein's intelligence gathering might just extend to the highest levels of government, both in the US and Israel. This makes sense when you learn that between 2013 and 2017, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak met with Jeffrey Epstein 36 times. Think about that. Epstein had monthly meetings throughout 2015 and 2016 with the Israeli former Prime Minister. And Barak wasn't just any other former politician. He'd previously served as the head of Israeli military intelligence. In 2015, Barak and Epstein formed a company called Carbine, which sells software to 911 call centers. It seems innocent enough, right? The software gives emergency services access to callers' cameras, their locations, and runs their identity through government databases. Investigative journalist Daryl Cooper explains this to Tucker Carlson.
Jeffrey Epstein provided the seed money for a tech company that Ehud Barak started up with a bunch of guys who were veterans of Unit 8200, which is like the Israeli NSA, basically a tech company.
However, Carbine's entire executive team consists of former Israeli intelligence operatives. The CEO of the company served in Unit 8200, basically Israel's version of the NSA. The co-founder also served in the same unit, and later worked for BlackQ, the private intelligence firm packed with former Mossad agents. But the American connections run just as deep. Carbine's board includes former Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff. Peter Thiel, the Palantir founder, is also a major investor, and this fits a broader pattern. The mega group that initially funded Epstein was packed with people connected to US intelligence. Ronald Lauder had served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and was a close friend of Roy Cohn, a lawyer with deep CIA and organized crime connections, and also the mentor of Donald Trump. Does anything about this sound familiar? Remember how triple agent Robert Maxwell had distributed software that looked legitimate but contained hidden backdoors for intelligence gathering? Now here was Epstein funding software that would be integrated into America's emergency response systems, controlled by intelligence operatives with deep government backing. That's a very interesting parallel between Epstein and triple agent Maxwell, who died on the yacht back in the 1990s. The Chinese government actually uses a smartphone app very similar to Carbine as part of its mass surveillance. So this might all have been about embedding intelligence assets directly into American infrastructure. So let's actually just reflect on what we've uncovered here. The impossible wealth with no legitimate source, the systematic protection from prosecution across multiple administrations, the sophisticated surveillance infrastructure, the targeting of the world's most powerful and notable figures through blackmail, the institutional response when he became a liability, and the disappearances of all those connected with him, on top of the deaths of the victims. This wasn't just the work of one strange, disgraced financier operating alone. This very well could have been a decades-long operation that compromised presidents, prime ministers, tech billionaires, and foreign royalty. The abuse wasn't the purpose, it was the method. The leverage was actually the goal. The Maxwell family's intelligence connections, Les Wexner's inexplicable financial backing, the protection that Acosta described as coming from intelligence, the former NSA agent John Schindler we talked about earlier concluding that given the industrial scale of Epstein's abuse over decades, with at least hundreds of victims, it would take a small army to keep that sordid operation going. Schindler's final assessment says the heart of the Epstein saga was a clandestine intelligence operation devoted to compromising and blackmailing rich and powerful people. Schindler is a highly respected figure in intelligence and academia, so this is a bombshell assessment that has somehow been confined to a Substack post rather than published widely by the media. In fact, no actual media company seems to be reporting on this at all, even though it's been going on for 6 years and is possibly one of the craziest stories in decades. But it all makes sense when you stop trying to understand Epstein as just a person and start seeing him as what many sources suggest him to be. As Weinstein said, we might just be living in a managed reality.
We live in managed reality. We are all in some version of the Truman Show.
Epstein as a construct was eliminated, but the architects who built him and his operation remain in the shadows, and there has been absolutely no repercussions. The main victims have now almost all been silenced and taken out, but the perpetrators have stayed protected. The operation was exposed, but the system is still here, playing its hand today. It might seem to be happening somewhere else in some fantasy land for the rich and powerful, but the skin-crawling truth is that this influences lives everywhere. The people we vote in power, Nobel Peace Prize winners, all the people that create our culture today and run our society could very well all be blackmailed. This is the real story, not the tale of just one man's crimes, but the revelation of how power really works. It's about how intelligence agencies operate with no oversight. It's about how the wealthy exist above the law. It's about how democratic institutions can be captured by forces operating in the shadows. The story refuses to die because the questions it raises about our world are too important to ignore. And until we get real answers about who Epstein really was and who he served, those questions will keep haunting us forever.